Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me. It's quite exciting to be here and share a little bit of the research that I've been doing for the last year and a half. This is an ongoing project that I've been doing as part of my research at the Department of Public Policy Management and Analytics here at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Before getting into more the nuts and bolts of what's going to be presented today, I'd like to introduce myself a little bit more, just to give you a little bit of context of where my research stands and the type of work that I'm doing. So before joining the academia, I actually worked for a regional government authority in Italy, from where I'm from. And I used to work for the digitalization unit for this regional authority, and we were in charge of helping other units and departments with their digitalization process. So how to turn from paper to digital. And when I got there, I got really surprised by how behind the government agencies was, how much of their activities and even recording of information was still very much paper-based. I remember working with the Human Service Department, and they were in charge of collecting data and information about nonprofit organizations, for instance, the funding, the number of employees, the type of work that they were doing, and all of that exchange and collection of data occurred entirely via mail. And I'm talking about physical mail, not even email. So if you wanted to have information about nonprofit in the territory, and we are talking about one of the richest region in Italy, you actually had to scan the paper and make yourself some PDF file and find a way to move from the PDF to actually creating a data set. So all the process was very time consuming and not digital at all. And that's what kind of prompted me to start working and doing my PhD around the topic of government digitalization. I like to say that I'm really a public management scholar. What I'm interested in understanding is how we can support the government side of digitalization, how we can encourage government agency to adopt, implement, and use digital and data tools in ways that impact positively our society and improve the way that public services are delivered. And of course, as time passes, the data tools is becoming more and more central to my research. I think we live in a datafied society, a datafied government, a datafied city, a datafied organization. Like everything around us can be turned into data. Any conversation, situation, and interaction that we have can be used to generate data. And that puts the way that we manage and govern this data kind of at the center of any digitalization process within the government. And my research tried to understand how we can govern and manage this datafication process within the government, and start by keeping in mind three kind of principles or guidelines that support my entire research work, and they bring us to today's talk. This is the way I summarize them from my husband when he asks me what I do. So I like to tell him that I really care about sharing, because sharing is caring. And so what's interesting to me is to understand how we can encourage government organizations to share their data. So I'm assuming that most of you are familiar or been at least looked at an open government website before, right? And so what I'm interested in understanding is how we can design incentives for organizations to provide those data on open government website. How do we get from the idea to actually get the agencies and public officials to implement them? But it's not just about open government data, it's really about how governments decide to provide data to other government agencies. I was talking to the department head of the Federal Affairs Department in a US state, and he was telling me that they don't even have a list of all the veterans that are residents in their state because of this lack of intergovernmental data sharing. So to me, one important question is how we can get government agencies to share their data. And of course, we want to do that because data are kind of the building blocks of our information and then knowledge. And as we know, information and knowledge are power. And so the more we can get them to share, the more we also need to think about what has been shared. How shared that are the data that are provided through this website or these data exchanges, data that are actually of good quality, data that are relevant for the questions and the problems that we want to solve within society, or just like low quality data that no one can use, or that are difficult to access, or that cannot be used because we lack metadata, we lack formatting. And so it's not just a matter of sharing, it's also a matter of what we share so that we can actually redistribute power and give power to people that utilizes this data. And of course, with great powers also come greater responsibility. I am more and more interested in looking in questions about how that data is provided, who is included in this process of sharing and opening data, and who gets excluded because they might lack skills, because they're not part of the conversations, and what is the role of government in this process to make sure that the way we share the data is actually a way to redistribute power. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today mostly. This research project came really about by thinking about these 3 principles. And we started by asking ourselves, how can we define principles of equity and inclusion in the context of government data and data sharing, including open government data? And once we define them, or we at least have an ideas about what we want to achieve, our government agency doing that? So to what extent are government agency adopting data practices or way of thinking and using and sharing their data that are built towards goals of equity and inclusion? And to address these questions, my colleague and I do want to acknowledge them. I have a few colleagues here at UIC and at other university that are working with me on this project. We start to look at issues related to open government data in the context of environmental justice. And this is part of a really broader research project that started by looking at what state governments were doing and mapping out open government data dashboards across US state government, talking with the stakeholders that were involved, and then moved into a nationwide survey of public managers to understand what were their values and perception in working with open government data, and again, to what extent equity and inclusion were considered. And then more recently, focus groups with local communities, especially in the Chicago area, to try to understand what are their perception of data and government trust and equity in relation of data. And this is kind of very preliminary, but I'm happy to take questions at the end of the talk. But for today, I'm mostly going to be focusing about this middle piece, this nationwide survey that was made possible because the Institute for Policy and Civic Engagement in UIC gave us a seed grant that allowed us to interview public managers across the country. And before getting into like the deep results and what we found out in the survey, let me just take a small step to get back and give you a little bit of background about how we define government data and what actually it means and how we can define equity and inclusion in the context of open government data, and why that it's even a question and not a given. Because sometimes I get some people telling me, well, but isn't like a given, shouldn't we always be thinking about equity? Well, when we look at the history of how governments have managed the data, that's not always be the case. We often talk about government as bureaucracy, and for a long time, governments themselves has been perceived as being this bureaucratic organization that had to focus on laws, rules, and procedures. So everything should be done in a certain way with a certain division of task. And in this context, for a long time, data were perceived to be an asset to be protected. Governments weren't releasing their data to the public. They were keeping them inside with the idea that only professional bureaucrats were the ones that were able to collect this data, analyze them, and make sense out of them. Things started to change in the 90s. As government had a lot of financial and economic crises, and they were kind of forced to do better, provide public services in a more efficient or effective way, become more accountable. That's when data started to be collected in larger quantity, mostly to measure the performance of the government. So it was not yet this idea that we have to release them to the public, but there was more intentional effort in collecting data regarding what the government was actually doing and the outcomes and outputs of the policies that the government were implemented. And that was kind of the prompt for the open government movement to not start, because some of this legislation was already there, but to become more prominent in the public debate and within government agency. And so data, instead of being interpreted as an asset to be protected within public organizations, they become more perceived as a public good that government should release to the public to increase transparency, public participation, collaboration, and information access. And in fact, just to give you some numbers, because sometimes we give that a little bit as a given by now, but just to give you some numbers, this is a work by some colleagues at the Rutgers University. As you can see, there's been this, what they did, they counted the number of time words such as open government data or transparency or collaboration appeared in federal agencies' programmatic documents. And as you can see, the number of times that these words appear in those documents substantially increased in the last 10 to 15 years. The biggest raise was here with the start of the Obama administration and the Open Government Memorandum on Transparency that was around 2009 over here. And so then we have a peak in 2012. So open government has been really a process of the last 20 years where more state, counties, and cities have started to release their data, and they started to implement some kind of open data projects. These are some numbers from a national-wide survey. Other projects have been in similar results. I don't think there is a really good and reliable census because there is some variation depending on which cities you're looking at and the responses that you get. But to give you kind of an idea, most cities, counties, and states have some kind of open data project. And that's great news because it means that this idea of openness and these values around transparency and collaboration have become an integral part of government activities. Now, what has not become as much of an integral part, or that was at least our question, is thinking about this data also through an equity lens instead of an openness lens. And by equity here, I'm really thinking about values related to justice and fairness and redistribution of power, redistribution of information. And data are a tricky object when we think about their relationship with equity, because research so far has shown that data can both be a source of inequity and equity at the same time. Data can and have been used widely by civic society organizations, by government, by research. SHIAC-NIGHT has project in this direction as well, to identify and highlight inequities in society. We use them to identify gaps in access to digital technology. They can be used to look at unequal exposure to pollution, police biases or marginalized communities, and those are just a few examples. But at the same time, there are also increasing concern about how data can reinforce existing inequities. Discussions related to biases in algorithms, over surveillance of marginalized groups, but also gaps in the skills and access that individuals have in terms of being able to collect and analyze data, which excludes some groups from policy conversation. The more policies are embedded in this datafied society, the more data becomes the currency to participate in these conversations. And so what we want to think about is to think a little bit more about how social equity should be thought of in relationship to data. And one key point is that for each step of the data value chain, the processes through which we work and make sense of data, each of the steps can have implication for social equity. So from the moment that data are collected to then the way that data are stored, analyzed, used, or even shared. And for each of these steps, it's important to ask questions related to, for instance, we need to collect accurate and complete data for all population groups. We also need to pay attention to not increase surveillance of marginalized population. When we analyze data, it's important to think about the literacy and data skills and advanced data methodology, but it's also important to think about the integration of local knowledge to really understand the historical and cultural context where these data come from, they were collected. It's also important to think about not just data used for decision-making, but also how we can integrate data with local narratives and histories, up to the point that sometimes I even ask myself whether data is always the best input for policies. And so the idea of equitable data practices is really this idea of how government is thinking or not thinking about equity throughout the data value chain. And in particularly, what we would like to see, or we want to see whether that was implemented by government agencies, was this idea of a governance of data, where any data subject, any residents or local communities that are subject to the data collected by the government, should have the ability to actually interrogate the government about how their data are collected, stored, analyzed, and used. And in this framework, it's really the government's responsibility to define these data practices and involve community in this shared governance of data. And it can be done in different ways, from co-designing rules for data access and collection, to integrating data collected by the community with government data, increase responsiveness to local needs, and so on. And those are kind of the type of questions that we asked in the service that we designed. Our goal was to investigate to what extent this idea of equitable data practices was infused into the operate and activities of environmental agencies in the United States. Why environmental agencies? We looked at environmental agencies because there's been more and more of a push toward issues of justice and equity within environmental policies, particularly with the idea of environmental justice, this concept that no group of individuals within a society should bear a higher or disproportionate burden related to pollution and hazardous waste and toxic sites and so on, that could result from both industrial, government, or commercial practices. And environmental justice has been put into the press and the public attention since the 80s, but Biden has really pushed this topic into his agenda. And it's a good topic to look for equitable data practices, not only because the policy issues themselves ask for attention to equity, but also because environmental justice is really a data-driven area where there's been a lot of effort to collect data to try to identify communities to prioritize for intervention. And so from the perspective of a lot of environmental agencies, environmental justice is really defined as the intersection of social vulnerability, defined as data on race, ethnicity, income, age, education, or language of local communities. Environmental vulnerability, so data about whether or not these communities are particularly exposed to damage and degradation because of high level of pollution, low level of air water quality, proximity to environmental hazard, and so on. And of course, whether the combination of the social and environmental vulnerability leads to adverse health outcomes. So communities that are subject to higher cancer rate or higher asthma risk. But a lot of the assessment of environmental justice policy and intervention has been really data-driven from the side of the government. And just to give you a couple of examples, this is the community impact assessment map that the city of Chicago released just a month ago, where it's trying to use the combination of all of this data to actually identify communities where environmental justice is a concern. But Chicago is not a unique example. There's actually a lot of state departments that are doing the exact same process, using data for decision making. And so since data are so much used in this area, it became for us really important to assess to what extent environmental agencies are thinking about equitable data practices. So we decided to design a survey to be administered to all individuals within a state environmental agencies that have potential to impact or manage this data value chain. So this process from the data collection to data use and sharing. And so we sent the survey to the agency leadership, environmental justice policy coordinators, managers in charge of enforcement of environmental regulations, and then also individuals that were in charge of IT, GIS, or open data within these environmental agencies. We sent the survey to a little bit over than 300 individuals. That was kind of a pilot surveys in the sense that we hope to collect more nationwide data on the topic in the next few months. But we did do the survey over the last summer, and we received a response rate of 16%. This might look really low, but in reality, that's generally a good response rate in terms of public managers actually replying to survey that you send to them. We got a good distribution of survey respondents, meaning that we got responses from 37 different states in the United States, both Democratic and Republican. And as I'm going to show you in a second, from both states that have a high level of involvement with environmental justice and states that are not doing as much in terms of open government data or environmental justice policies, which makes that interesting to look at the results we got. But let me give you some insight and some preliminary results that we had so far. So first of all, for each of the states, we look at to what extent they are already providing some type of data to the public to assess the environmental justice concern within their own communities. You can see a map here. The blue states, the dark blue states like Pennsylvania or Michigan, are the states that actually have good platforms that are very easy to access and provide not only a lot of data, but data that are actually usable of good quality. The light blue ones, they provide some type of data to assess mostly social vulnerabilities, but they lack good environmental data. That's, for instance, the case of the state of Illinois. The gray states are the ones that provide environmental hazard data, but they don't pay as much attention to social vulnerabilities. And the white states are the ones that don't provide either of those data. And so we're still talking about a country that is split with still too few states actually providing good open government data on this specific topic. And yet, when we ask our respondents to what extent they were involved into environmental justice activities, a vast majority of them report that they are at least involved to some extent, if not to a great extent. Only 2%, which is actually a couple of people, who are not involved in environmental justice. And those are individuals that works for IT or GIS departments, where they provide widespread support to the agencies, but not necessarily on environmental justice specifically. Now, more interesting. As I mentioned before, this idea of collaboration and open government is becoming more and more integrated into government activities, and we can actually see that by looking at some of this graph. This graph, for instance, show how frequently stakeholders interact with these government officials. And as you can see, frequency is particularly high. Most of them have weekly to bi-weekly interaction with government agencies. The ones that interact the least often are tribal leaders and researchers. And as a researcher, this is not really surprising to me. And then in terms of influence, the red bar over here show the level of influence that these groups have over government activities. And as you can see, the results are pretty stable across all groups at 3.5 over 5, which is a mild level of influence. So there now seems to be a stakeholder group that is so much more influenced than the others. We then ask them how they involve citizens. Okay, so they interact often with citizens, so what do they do with them? And as you can see here, so the first item is about whether they just involve citizens in explaining decisions that the government is already making. And that gets the highest percentage of consensus. So most of respondents agree that they involve citizens and in explaining them their decisions. The more we move into more active items, whether or not they involve citizens in identifying goals, developing strategies to reach those goals, or evaluating the achievement of the agencies, this percentage drops significantly. So a lot of this engagement with citizens is passive rather than being active. And we can find a similar results once we look at the tools that these government agencies are using to engage the public in data collection, sharing, or use. Most of the tools, like the ones at the top over here, are what we call government-led tools. Tools where the citizens are not actively involved in providing any inputs. While the more we move towards here, the more we have citizen-led tools, tools where actually citizens can do something, like citizens advisory boards, citizen science program, collaborative or code sharing tools, or even data hackathons. The percentage here drops significantly at 40% or lower. The only exception in this graph are online citizens reporting apps, where cities can report a hazardous waste site or site where they think the pollution levels are particularly high. And we did look at those apps specifically, but in a lot of cases, while citizens can provide the inputs, it's kind of filtered by government agencies, and they're not required to necessarily either respond to them or to report the data about what they did. There are a few exceptions of states that actually do really good in using those inputs to create map or to feed them their own data, but they are the exception rather than the rules. In terms of data practices, like what those government officials do with the data, so most of them are quite highly engaged in making data, trying to design rules to make data more accessible or usable, publishing data on the open government website, designing new rules and procedures to facilitate data access, engaging stakeholders, or even creating, developing, or maintaining environmental justice focused data tools. As you can see, the two bars here that measures to a very large or to a moderate extent reach almost the 70%, on average, a 70% mark. And that's really good news, especially because some of these individuals are not necessarily working in the GIS or the open data unit, which means that a moderate engagement is still a pretty good indicators of how integrated this idea of openness is with government activities. But the percentage drops significantly when we start asking about equitable data practices, to what extent they actually work with local communities, particularly minority and low-income communities, in improving their capacity of using the data or integrating their knowledge into policymaking, or collecting community-level data. And as you can see, we move from an average of 70% to a much lower average of 50%. Meaning that only one state out of two is even occasionally thinking about involving those communities in the governance of data in ways that might give those communities a right to interrogate how the government is collecting, using, or sharing this data. And in fact, something that we were kind of interested in looking at is how the public officials think about being accountable to others. And in most cases, they rank themselves as being accountable to the public at large or their own organizations. They're much more likely to put the community that they represent in the first or second position when asked to rank these different audiences. And while the public at large is a good indicator, it's still like a broad, unidentifiable entity, which makes more likely to be open, but not necessarily be equitable, or at least that's one of the hypotheses we are somewhat exploring. We also ask to what extent this idea of doing equitable data practices and pursuing equity is in conflict with other goals of their organizations. As I mentioned before, the way that governments data were framed has changed over time. And so we asked them to what extent they think that equity is a challenge for the achievement of policy goals, or to the extent to which pursuing equity might decrease the efficiency of their organizations. And well, good news is most of them don't believe that equity is at stake with any of those goals, which means that an integration of different data practices could be possible within organizations. At the same time, and this is something that emerged a lot also from our interviews with some of these public officials, there is also a strong perception that just by following rules and procedures, we are able to promote equity. So some of this bureaucratic background of government is kind of still pervasive in the operation of government organizations. And finally, we generally ask about political priorities by recognizing the importance of elected officials in driving some of these data practices. As you can see, there is somewhat support for open government data formal plans or open government data initiatives. But there is less support yet for now about the importance of delivering equitable policy outcomes. And to put environmental justice as a high priority for elected officials. I didn't report the average here, but this item has a slightly lower average. So what does these results tell us about what's going on in the government in terms of equitable data practices? So first of all, it seems that, as other research has shows, this idea of openness is more and more integrating into environmental agencies' practices, with governments actually putting effort into utilizing different data tools and engaging with the public. We should though remember that we are still in a kind of a split countries where 1/3 of the state does not provide any environmental data in an open government format on their websites. There's also still a significant gap in engagement, at least for as far as we can tell from these preliminary findings. A lot of the data tools are still government-led. They don't require any community input. And a lot of this sense of accountability by public official tends to be more internally focused or broadly defined rather than specific to the community, to their local communities. And so finally, these equitable data practices that we were thinking about were only marginally implemented. There is little engagement that is actually active for the public throughout the entire data value chain. And there is a lot of focus on equity as equal treatment, so like rules and procedures, rather than actually outcome and engagement. And this is like an important implication. A lot of the fact that we don't still have equitable data practice means that a lot of the data that government is providing is somewhat embedded in a very top-down approach with low integration with community data. And that can have, and we saw that in interviews with government officials being concerned about the quality of data that are collected by communities and more concerned about regulation and requirement. So there is real barriers in trying to make data practices more open to the public. But at the same time, we all are also starting to observe that the fact that there is not such governance of shared governance of data also means that residents and local communities sometimes do not trust the data that are shared by the government. They question how data are collected, whether data are actually representative of all population groups, and whether those data actually capture needs and concern of the local communities. And so there is a need for governments to think about cultural change and implement more equitable open government data practices. The question is, what can we do next? And I'm happy to have a conversations around this topic. These are some of the ideas that we got by working on this topic also across different areas. First of all, it's generally good, or we think it's generally good to start by building a common understanding of what we mean by equitable data practices. What I presented today is one perspective that colleagues and I have been talking on, or other researchers have been working on. But the starting point is to agree about what we mean by equitable data practice. What does it mean to consider equity across the data value chain? It's also important to institutionalize some of these practices. What standards should a city apply in order to increase their attentions toward equity? And so we know that a lot of cities are designing, for instance, digital equity plans, but in a lot of those plans, and this is a result from another project, in a lot of those plans, there is no mentions about data and what equity means for data. So maybe we should start by thinking about charts and guidelines for equitable data sharing and use. And I know there are examples in other fields like science, but also from civic society, but government have not institutionalized them yet. There is also a few examples from government. Actually, I only found one so far, which is the city of San Jose, California, that has moved to approved data equity and privacy plans. So, for instance, they are promising to create standards to make sure that all open government data that are released by the city can be easily linked with socioeconomic data at the census tract level that are provided by the city themselves. And finally, I do think also that it's still important to question the role of data. Do we actually always need data? Are data always the best starting point? And what is a way to integrate data with narratives and local stories? The more I do work on data and I talk to people about data, the more I'm convinced that data are important and it's a common language and currency in the policymaking system. But I also start to think more and more about approaches to integrate data with local stories so that we don't only interpret data in a vacuum, but we actually link them to the local, the cultural and historic context from where those data come from. And I think that's kind of closed my speech. I really thank you for allowing me to share my ideas, but I also look forward to any inputs and questions that you might have. This is very much of an in-progress work, and so we are very happy to discuss feedback. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Really, really interesting work. Great, so we will move on to the Q&A portion of this evening. So again, if you do have any questions, feel free to go ahead and put them in the YouTube chat feature there, and we will get to them here in a minute. I guess to start things off, one of the questions that we had in the audience there, I think kind of going, it came in kind of earlier on in your presentation. So when you're kind of like, presenting about some of the, potential downsides of data and government having data, right, as around surveillance. And so one of the questions that came up was, how do you balance open data with kind of the increasing and our increasing surveillance society in the cases or in the case of agencies reporting on their citizens, which in of itself can certainly contribute to inequity, that surveillance. So how do you kind of balance that?
It's a good question, and I don't think there is an answer. I think my talk is more about opening questions than providing like set in stone answers. Also because I think that thinking about governance of data for me is about thinking about shared governance of data. And so that model of governance might change across agencies, across cities, across state, also depending on the communities that are involved. And it might depend on the type of data that we are collecting. I think one of the major issues with over surveillance, for instance, is the lack of control that you have over the data that are collected or how they're collected or how they're stored, for how long, who can access them. There is really a lack of control about how the data are government and managed once they are collected. And I think it's really important to ask those questions in terms of, it's good to collect the data, right? But the question is, once we collect them, where are they stored, for how long we can access them? And so to me, the real issues is, before even thinking about it's really thinking about the roots of the problem. Like, do we need just data, and how, if so, and we collect them, what do we do with them? And creating more of a shared governance models around government data. And to be fairly honest, I talk about all government data, but I do the same work in science data and the data that we as researchers use, because I think we have some of the same issues that government has.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I can imagine data as a whole. I work in the healthcare industry, so yeah, a lot of data issues there as well. So yeah, I think all kinds of industries and groups have a lot of thoughts and a lot of thinking to do about data. And I wanted to one of the questions I had myself, kind of picking up on something that you had noted there too, just in terms of people, citizens kind of deciding like what government should be collecting data about, how long they should, be able to store that data, how they should store the data. One of the things that kind of popped into my mind is like how, and I guess maybe before how, like, do you distinguish in your research data that is more for like pure bureaucratic purposes? So I'm thinking like, birth records, real estate sale records, like stuff like that government just kind of has to do for bureaucratic purposes, versus data that is more for policy, decision making, stuff like that. And how, I guess, how do the people that you surveyed or interview like make that distinction or not? Or how does that kind of come into play?
That's a great question that too few people ask actually. So yes, I generally pay a lot of attention in distinguishing between what I call administrative data right? The data that government needs to collect to perform their daily activities, and then policy data, which is what the main topic of today's talk. So this project is mostly focused on policy data, so data that feed into policy-making process, and they're collected about citizens or policy outcome. I did other projects on administrative data that are mostly internally used. And I think for this, and this tends to be even a little bit more regulated, and they have different issues of sharing. Administrative data, for instance, tend to be shared much more informally through personal connection and channel, and they're not necessarily put on always on open government data. And there's also more issues on identifiable information, for instance. So I think in that case, formal regulation is also really, really important. Whereas some of these policy data are different, because sometimes they're collected at the aggregate level, they're more easily released on open government data, have more impact on communities. So I think today's talk is really mostly about the policy data side of it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and then kind of more specifically the kind of data you were looking at in terms of like environmental justice data, a question around that. Can you share a bit more about kind of why you chose to focus on environmental justice data for your research instead of other common government data on budgets, education, policing?
There are two reasons. One was somewhat, it happened. This is a collaborative project. I had a few. I'm not an expert in environmental justice. My focus is really on the datification and digitalization. I had a colleague that was interested in environmental justice, and so we started off this project together. But the more I've been looking into the context of environmental justice, I think it's a really interesting setting for this type of questions for two reasons. One is because the government is trying to use data for policy making and to address the existing inequity. So the main reasons for using data in this context is addressing inequities. But in doing so, they're kind of putting aside of the questions of whether the data are equitable themselves and the way that these data are collected or management is equitable, which to me is kind of an interesting paradox, if you will, because we're trying to use data for the greater good, but that's not always what communities perceived. We're doing some interviews with local stakeholders, and in the conversation we are having, there is really a lot of concerns about whether those data are good, whether they were collected in the right way, where they represent what they should be representing, whether we have gaps that the government is not showing in this data. And for me, all of that raises questions about how you can use the data to address the inequities, but you are kind of not addressing the underlying questions about what equity means in the moment in the other phases of data value chain, which is also the collection and sharing part.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I guess kind of going off that, one of the points you made in terms of like talking with people and thinking or worrying that they're kind of not getting the broader context, they're not getting the right kind of data. Another question that came in kind of around that is how do you think we could promote kind of more citizen sourced data or citizen sourced approaches in absence of just paying citizens for that work?
That's a very good question. So there is a lot of issues, especially so environmental justice is a huge policy area where there's been a lot of playing around and experiments in collecting citizens' data by installing air monitoring at citizens' house, having them collecting water sample or soil sample to be analyzed. And a lot of these are done more for demonstrative scope. They're not generally used or recognized by the government in policymaking process, which is also an important kind of barriers. I think so. As researchers, we're trying to partner with some of these communities by providing infrastructure or the expertise to help them thinking about how to collect the data. But there is also in some of the conversation that we had, what emerged is not necessarily that citizens want to collect their data firsthand because they understand some of these limitations or the efforts that are required. But in some cases, what they want some of these communities is to involve in the design of the data collection. Like if we're collecting pollution data, where should we collect them? What is the best moment of the day? What about the wind direction that moves pollution around in the air? So in some cases, it's not the direct data collection, but it's also just helping in the designing this data collection and providing knowledge about the context in the community where they live, so that the data collection can be designed in a way that they think is useful and collecting the right data that should be collected. So I don't think it's just about the technical aspects and time.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Kind of going off that then, besides just researchers, what role do you think, others like journalists, nonprofits, civic technologists, try Hacknight us,
Yes.
Have in kind of increasing access to open government data, helping with this?
Well, like research in general, open government data is wide. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but in my field, this type of organizations are widely recognized as actually the organization that makes open government data useful. A lot of research says that just providing them out there, or everyday citizens who are not going to be using the data, right? But the open government data movement has thrived because of this collective civic society organization that act as intermediaries between the government and citizens. So your work is widely recognized, just for you to know. And but I do think, right, that there is this idea that we need skills, we need capacity to utilize this data, and this organization, that's what they bring onto the table. I also think that when I think about a shared governance model, I do think that it's really important that your type of organizations, right, are the ones that can really work in between the two components in providing support, insight, and expertise, and somewhat mediate that relationship. Something that we're noticing is that with some of this community, the relationship with the government has been getting worse and worse over time. There is a lot of lack of trust that's missing there, and some of them are looking for mediators or individuals that can help bridging that gap. And I think that's the role that for a lot of nonprofit or civic society organization could play in thinking about the governance of data.
Okay. Yeah, it's really good to know that there is definitely still a place for kind of those middle organizations who do some of that translation work.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. On a slightly different topic, somebody had asked, have you looked into the relationship between open data policies and FOIA laws for each state, for the states you're looking at? And is there a correlation between that?
So not for this project, I'll be very honest. I haven't looked at that for this project specifically. We have been looking at whether the state, so every state has FOIA laws, right? But what we've been looking is that there has been some study in looking at whether the states have more specific data sharing or open government legislations, and whether that's correlate with the likelihood that they have environmental justice open government data portals. And those are generally highly correlated, if that was the question. But in general, like I'm speaking a little bit more broadly here, there has been a lot of research showing that legislation on data sharing or open government data, it's then correlated with the realization of these portals.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting to know that correlation with the portals.
Right. Like legal grounding is really one of the main factors, and then leads government to develop some of these initiatives.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question here. So I guess finally, in your research, what are some of the most successful data literacy programs or initiatives that you've seen?
I'm not sure I can answer this question, to be very honest. No,
Stumped you with the last question.
No, the reason why it's because I generally tend to focus much more on the government side. So I could tell you probably what are the best portals that the governments have developed. And I've been only recently working more with the user and community side. So part of this is a little new to me. So I don't want to point the finger to anything, I would say.
Okay. Who would you say has the best portal then?
Right now on environmental justice, I think North Carolina is a really good portal. Yes. And I mean, Washington and California are the historical one, and like states like North Carolina are new and more recent, but they have been integrating different approaches in visualizing the data compared to, like, for instance, California, which is kind of interesting.
Okay. Didn't rate Chicago up there. That's all right.
Well, Illinois is lagging a little bit behind on implementing a good portal. They have a lot of, like, maps, but not really things that are more interactive and more dashboards kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So
I believe. And unfortunately, I think we are at time here. So thank you again so much, Federica Fusi, for joining us this evening. And so now we will move on to the hacking portion of this evening. So coming up on the screen again should be the link to the post-presentation Zoom call, which you can join now, and we'll see about posting it here in the YouTube chat as well. So it'll be easily available for you. And with that, I will end how we usually always end our presentation by saying, go forth and hack.
Thank you so much.